Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and call to order this meeting of the Horseshoe Crab Management Board. My name is Justin Davis. I'm the Administrative Commissioner from the state of Connecticut and currently serving as chair of this board. Our first item on the agenda today is approval of the agenda. I'll look around the room to see if there are any suggested additions to the meeting agenda as posted in the meeting materials. All right, not seeing any takers, we'll consider the agenda approved by consent. Next item on the agenda is approval of the proceedings from the meeting of this board earlier this year in April. Again, I'll look around the table and online to see if there are any suggested additions or edits to those minutes as posted in the meeting materials. All right, not seeing any takers, moving right along. Okay, our third item on the agenda today is public comment. As a reminder, this would be public comment related to any items that are not on today's agenda. So if there's anybody in the room from the public who's interested in providing comment, at this time, you can walk forward to the public microphone over here on the corner of the table directly across from me and be recognized. And as a reminder, if you come to the table to make public comment, please start off by just giving your name and affiliation. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Benji Swan. I'm with Limuli Laboratories in Cape May, New Jersey, and I did submit a written comment. My comment is general, and I decided I would read it as well. It shouldn't only take a few minutes. Dear Atlantic State Marine Fishery Commission board members, I want to take a moment to express my gratitude for the incredible efforts over the past 25 years in managing the horseshoe crab population. Our collective work has led to a remarkable increase in horseshoe crabs, protections for spawning populations, significant reductions in harvest for bait, the establishment of monitoring and reporting requirements, and the implementation of best management practices for biomedical use. These efforts ensure that we maintain a healthy and sustainable horseshoe crab population for future generations. We've not only focused on horseshoe crabs, we've integrated the needs of the red knot into our management strategies, collaborating with environmental groups to develop the Adaptive Resource Modeling Plan, the ARM model, an unprecedented achievement. As part of the ARM framework, a survey was designed to monitor the red knot population. The survey conducted by the United States Geological Service shows a stable red knot population since 2012. With 25 years of data and insights at our disposal, we are in a strong position to continue this success. However, it's time for us to shift our focus. While we have made significant strides in Delaware Bay, we must extend our conservation efforts to other horseshoe crab populations along the coast. By directing our resources and applying the successful practices we've implemented in the Delaware Bay region, we can make meaningful impact elsewhere. The narrative surrounding the red knot, the fate of the red knot, often overshadows our accomplishments. However, it's essential that we move beyond past debates and instead focus on proactive solutions. Let's expand our knowledge while continuing to use the ARM model to manage the Delaware Bay population for the sake of the horseshoe crabs themselves and the entire ecosystem, which includes the red knot. Also, protecting human health should be a top priority. The production of limulus amoebocyte lysate from horseshoe crabs used to test for bacterial endotoxin contamination in pharmaceutical drugs and medical devices must continue. While advancements in testing are important, we must be cautious. The synthetic alternatives to LAL are unregulated and may not detect natural endotoxins reliably. The potential risks to public health are too significant to overlook, and any switch to a synthetic alternative test should be slow and risk adverse, especially in light of the fact that the biomedical use of horseshoe crabs has a negligible effect on their population. As stewards of this vital ecosystem, we must counter the sensational narratives that hinder biomedical companies in our conservative efforts. It's time to educate the public, foster a collaborative approach to continue to successfully manage the horseshoe crab population. Let's focus on the future, build on our successes, and implement proven strategies where they are most needed. Enough's enough. let's move on together. And thank you.
Thank you for that comment. Is there anyone else from the public here who would like to make public comment today? Just looking around the room. Do we have anybody online? Okay. We'll move along to the next item on our agenda, which will be a report out on the outcomes from a stakeholder workshop on Delaware Bay management objectives that was conducted earlier this year. And to start us off, we're going to have a presentation from Dr. Christina Weaver, who is joining us online. So Dr. Weaver, if you're there, you can go ahead and take it away.
Yes, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So glad to be here. Thank you for having me. Again, my name is Christina Weaver, and I was the facilitator who helped to support the Horseshoe Crab Management Objective Stakeholder Workshop this past summer. And I'm going to provide just a brief overview of the key attributes of this workshop and the key findings before passing to Caitlin Starks with the ASMFC to talk a little bit about some of the recommendations for next steps. Just really want to appreciate the incredible staff who worked with me, who I had an opportunity to work with as part of this project. In particular, Tony Kearns, Caitlin Starks, and James Boyle, as well as the board. Really enjoyed this opportunity. So for this presentation, I'll say a few words about the background context. I'm not an expert in horseshoe crabs or in red knot. I'm a public policy and environmental mediator. So it was very interesting for me to get to learn more about this context. And then just toggling back to the last slide for a second, following that, we'll talk a little bit about the workshop process and in particular the consensus building method that we used. And then I'll provide an overview of the key findings from the workshop, including areas where participants achieved consensus agreements and areas of robust dialogue where there were efforts to achieve consensus that were not reached. And then again, we'll transition into talking about some of the next steps that were identified by the workshop, and Caitlin Starks will be able to cover that in greater detail. So moving into the background, as I'm sure the board and many, if not all, who are on the webinar recognize, the horseshoe crab resource is vitally important and interesting, and there is a lot of stakeholder dialogue and at times disagreement around management. So the workshop was really an opportunity to kind of go deeper around dialogue around those areas of disagreement and see where there might be common ground. To just provide an overview of the history, adaptive resource management is a framework that was implemented in 2012 and allowed for setting bait harvest specifications in the Delaware Bay region. There had been 0 Delaware Bay origin female harvest since 2013, and there still is not female harvest. But the revision of the ARM framework in 2021, which was adopted for management in 2022, did allow for the introduction of female harvest for the first time since 2013. And this, perhaps among other factors, generated considerable public input and public concern over the possibility of female harvest. This was the impetus for a stakeholder survey that was conducted in 2023 that did really surface that there are a variety of important stakeholder perspectives on adaptive resource management of horseshoe crab, in particular looking at red knot shorebirds, for whom eggs are an important food source as part of their migration patterns, looking at the interests of commercial bait fishermen who rely on horseshoe crabs, looking at the interests of biomedical industry and the collection of blood for the creation of a clotting agent that's important to human health. And as we learned in the workshop, also shore communities that really care about the welfare of the horseshoe crab for its intrinsic value. So lots of different interests around this resource. And as a result of what was sort of surfaced in the survey, there was a sense that having a workshop that would bring a small group of people around the table to kind of go deeper in their dialogue really more fully understand one another's perspectives and see where there might be areas of common ground was identified as the next step. So we can move into the workshop development. In the next slide. So again, the board recognized a need for multi-stakeholder dialogue to explore objectives and management approaches for the Delaware Bay horseshoe crab fishery. And I can say, as the facilitator and mediator who was brought in to support this process, there was really a very open sense of wanting to really understand what degree of common ground or shared interests might be uncovered over a day and a half of intensive dialogue. To support that goal, there was a decision to retain a neutral third party, and that's the support that I provided as a facilitator. To say a little bit about my own background, I am a human cultural geographer who worked for many years, for about 12 years, with the Institute for Engagement and Negotiation at the University of Virginia, which has a 40+ year history in environmental mediation. Now I do similar work as a consultant through my own LLC, but basically have worked particularly in Virginia and the Mid-Atlantic region on a whole variety of issues. And about a year ago was selected as the mediator facilitator to work on sort of a similar workshop around menhaden in the Chesapeake Bay. So have some fisheries background, but again, was brought on more for my process expertise than for my subject matter expertise. One of the suggestions that I made when we started the process of designing the workshop was to have sort of an assessment phase, which consisted of conducting some open-ended interviews with a subset of participants who could sort of represent the stakeholder interests. And the purpose of that was really to bring me up to speed further in the issues and to inform design of the workshop to try and support really constructive and productive dialogue. Next slide. So as an overview of the stakeholder groups that were convened in this workshop, we had bait fishery harvesters and dealers and bait users. We had members of the environmental NGO community, the biomedical industry, horseshoe crab and shorebird biologists, and state resource managers. We had a total of 12 stakeholders and then 8 staff around the table for a combined total of 20 voices at this workshop. The staff who participated were there to really lend their technical assistance and expertise, and at times weighed in on some of the consensus building, and at other times abstained. We sort of left that to their discretion. And I really just want to take a moment to thank all of the individuals who participated in the workshop. It really was a very robust and collegial dialogue over the day and a half that we were together, and really felt that people leaned in and did very good work together. The purpose of the workshop, as we had defined it, and this purpose was really refined in consultation with the ASMFC staff that convened the workshop, and then with the insights from those assessment interviews I mentioned. But we defined sort of 3 layers of purpose or goals for the workshop. One was really to increase understanding of the various stakeholder perspectives and interests. So there was recognition that there had been a fair amount of public input and public discourse around the issues. There had been a survey, but perhaps there had not yet been an opportunity for stakeholders to themselves ask direct questions of one another and really be listening for deeper understanding. We also, and this was an issue that was really substantiated by the assessment interviews, we wanted to provide a context for greater understanding of current horseshoe crab modeling. So there was a recognition that the science and the way the science is described can sometimes be difficult to explain, especially to lay audiences and to the public. And so there was a desire to at least increase the collective shared understanding of the current modeling approach and the science, the scientific inputs and data for those who were around the table. And then the final objective was to really identify what were the concerns, what were the alternative ideas and suggestions, and what were the areas of possible common ground for horseshoe crab management that this group of 20 people could identify over a day and a half. Next slide. So I had proposed, and the group took up and affirmed during the workshop a consensus building process, which basically can be used as a way to surface areas of agreement and disagreement, and to encourage participants to be in sort of a solutions mindset. So the dialogue process, in addition to establishing this baseline knowledge and understanding through technical presentations at its outset, most of the workshop was really about building consensus through this process. And the way it looked was individual participants in the group, with my support as a facilitator, would essentially bring ideas to the table, proposals or recommendations. And then we would go through an iterative process of essentially seeing where everybody in the room stood around those ideas. I had people put up one finger when they wanted to indicate full support for an idea, two fingers when they wanted to support an idea or they were willing to support an idea, but they did want the group to know that they had questions and concerns. And then I think this grid is actually inverted, so it would be 3 fingers indicated full support, 2 indicated support but with questions and concern, and 1 finger would indicate you cannot support given too many questions and concerns. It doesn't really matter, but if you do review the report that was provided, you'll see that inversion of the numbers. But basically, this consensus building process allows for this kind of gradient of agreement, where folks can see, okay, how serious is the opposition to an idea, or maybe how much support might there be in the room for an idea. Once we sort of test where people are at with a given idea, the process then became very much an iterative dialogue, where I, as a facilitator, would turn to those who objected to the idea and ask them to share more about their objections, and if possible, to share how they might modify the proposal or the recommendation or the idea to get them closer to support. And so we had a really rich iterative process of kind of working through several proposals and several recommendation ideas. And we arrived at several areas of common ground this way, as well as several areas where there was really robust dialogue, but common ground or consensus-based common ground, which indicates all 3s or 2s, there's nobody sort of completely opposing the idea, was not quite reached, but there was robust dialogue. At the end of each day of the workshop, we did also have public participation, public input, which was captured in the report as well. So from here, having explained the process, I will move into some of the key findings of that consensus building effort. There were 5 statements or recommendations around which the people in the room achieved consensus or broad agreement. Now, as a reminder, some people may have abstained from providing their 1, 2, or 3 kind of indication of agreement for these statements. Typically, some of the staff may have abstained because they felt that it was not really in their purview. But in this organic process, we essentially had nobody who fully objected to these ideas. So the first 3 are on this slide. One was that, participants put out there, they would like to know whether the group could agree that the horseshoe crab population had in fact increased in the Delaware Bay since 2010. And there was consensus in the workshop that this was in fact the case. There was also a consensus recommendation developed that the ASMFC should conduct outreach to gather the essential concerns of key stakeholders. So there was a sense that it would be important to gain a deeper understanding, especially of those stakeholder groups or communities or networks that had greater concerns around the ARM model. And then another area of agreement that ASMFC should devote some resources towards improving science communication about the ARM, including optimizing existing channels for engaging with the public. And to give some context for that, There was robust dialogue about the need for just better science communication about this modeling, but also recognition that there might be many existing channels within the ASMFC that could be activated to do this kind of work. Next slide. Okay, so one of the really interesting outcomes in terms of the consensus agreements was that there was a recommendation to use current ASMFC processes to refine the ARM reward and utility functions with stakeholder input. And as I recall, this was an idea that some of the scientists around the table strongly advocated for as a very appropriate and very useful sort of sphere of influence where stakeholders could really shape the data going into the ARM. And this idea did achieve consensus. I think looking at my notes and looking at the report, we had around 7 participants who registered full support for this idea and another 5 who registered that they would support it, perhaps with some questions and concerns. And we did have, again, robust dialogue around each of these. In the report that was prepared, we have an overview of each of them and then additional sort of notes from the dialogue in the appendix. And then the final consensus statement was that the ASMFC should continue to run the ARM by default with a recommendation to pause female harvest in the meantime while the other recommendations, the other consensus-based recommendations are implemented and stakeholder input is further considered. So this was probably one of the most significant areas of common ground achieved in the workshop, essentially a decision to continue to run the ARM. So there was this affirmation that adaptive resource management is desired, but a default recommendation to pause female harvest for now while these other ideas are implemented. And from there, we can move into areas where consensus was not reached. So each of these areas are worth mentioning and worth including because there was such robust dialogue. In the report on the workshop, we include the sort of breakdown of quote unquote votes, the 3, 2, 1 for each of these. So reviewers of the report can get a sense of how much disagreement or objection was there. But essentially consensus was not reached on the idea that female harvest is appropriate under some circumstances. For this one, we had 2 participants who registered a cannot support too many questions and concerns, which in this 3-2-1 consensus model would be a 1. They cited that the case for expanding to female harvest has not been adequately justified, that there are remaining concerns with the model. They cited an understanding that perhaps red knots really need a superabundance, quote unquote, of eggs that may exceed what would be deemed as sustainable level for horseshoe crabs. And really a desire to represent the interests of NGO members that might not have been around the table was also one of the reasons. Also a concern that more time might be needed to fully assess data about female horseshoe crab abundance and red knot population trends. And sort of just a more cautious sense that we've only recently turned the corner with population of horseshoe crab and should be cautious. So those were some of the reasons that consensus was not reached around this. I will say that 11 participants registered full support of that first bullet. The next one was the idea that the ASMFC should revert to a harvest control rule and not use adaptive resource management. This was really interesting because we actually had all participants who participated in this consensus test, there were 12 of them, who registered a 1, meaning that they cannot support this idea. So in a way, it was not a consensus achieved, but it was sort of a default affirmation that there is a preference for adaptive resource management. And I think that that was one of the open questions going into the workshop, so that was a very interesting finding. The next area of dialogue where consensus was not reached was around the idea that we should pause running the ARM to focus on modeling for male-only harvest based in science. And the idea behind this recommendation was really to value the time and the resources devoted by the modelers and recognize that perhaps if we're not going to fully follow the sort of recommendations that come out of the model, it might make sense to kind of pause adaptive resource management. Most of the participants who consensus tested for this said that they could not support it, so that was 7. We only had 1 person registering full support of this idea. And you know, it really came down to not wanting to relinquish adaptive resource management, really valuing that approach, even if there are some concerns about the implications for the recommendation of female harvest. Okay, and then the next one captured on the screen is around a suggestion to really work on a conflict resolution process with those NGOs who have the most objection to some of the outcomes of the ARM model. There was extensive discussion about this. We did have 7 participants who fully supported, another 2 who would support with questions and concerns, but 3 participants registered that they could not support it. And the primary concern really was that there would be a perception of unfairness for the ASMFC to hold private meetings with some but not all stakeholder groups or communities, and that this might discredit and undermine the rigorous external peer review process in place to evaluate the science of the ARM framework. So this sort of segued into, you know, where we did achieve consensus, which was around finding processes and using existing channels within the ASMFC to really listen deeply to what the stakeholder concerns are. Okay, so moving to the next slide. So those were the areas where consensus was achieved and the areas of robust dialogue where we did have efforts to craft consensus proposals, but we didn't quite get there in terms of full common ground. The conclusion of the workshop was very memorable for me as the facilitator because we went around the room and the participants really universally affirmed that the workshop had met its core goals. So we had achieved an increased understanding of the various stakeholder perspectives and interests. Folks that had a chance to really listen to one another and to gain new insights into the issues and to each other's interests and perspectives. There was also agreement echoed around the table that there was an improved and increased understanding of the current horseshoe crab modeling, thanks in large part to some excellent technical presentations that staff provided and to the dialogue that ensued. And there was generally just an appreciation for the collegiality, for the professional respect, for the positive dialogue as folks surfaced their concerns, their ideas, and worked very earnestly to uncover where there might be areas of common ground, despite sort of a context of some conflict around how this resource should be managed. And from here, I'll segue into just at a high level, introducing some of the recommendation ideas that came from the workshop, and then Caitlin Starks will step in and provide a little more flesh on the bones as a member of the ASMFC staff who understands better how these recommendations could be implemented. So at a high level, there were many potential next steps that were discussed through the workshop. Some of these really relate to those consensus agreements. And you see the key ideas on this slide. So the first is to initiate an addendum for an interim solution around how the ARM modeling would proceed. The second is to really have dialogue with key stakeholders to identify, quote, essential concerns. That was the phrasing that really came out of the workshop. a sincere desire to kind of go even deeper in understanding what's really at the core of these concerns. The third, initiate a process to develop alternative reward and utility functions with stakeholder engagement. This seemed to be a really rich opportunity where stakeholders could truly shape how the ARM framework is implemented in ways that are also very helpful to the scientists running the model. There were also recommendations and ideas around evaluating the membership of the advisory panel and whether there might be opportunities to make the panel even more representative, of the range of stakeholder concerns. And lots of interest around efforts to improve science communication about the ARM, especially through using existing channels that might not be fully optimized within the ASMFC. And with that, I think Caitlin is going to come up and go over each of these in more detail.
Thanks, Christina. So just to add a little more to these recommendations. So the first suggested next step was to initiate an addendum to establish an interim solution for setting specifications while the other workshop recommendations related to the ARM are addressed. And the consensus of the workshop participants was that the ARM should continue to be used, but that female harvest should be paused during the time needed to address those other recommendations. So to achieve this, an addendum could be used to allow for setting multi-year specifications based on the ARM as an interim solution, so that female harvest could be set to 0 for a longer period than 1 year to allow for additional work on the ARM to be done. So if the board initiated an addendum today, it could be completed before next fall so that it could be used during the specification setting process for 2026 harvest. And then the next consensus-based suggestion is to begin a dialogue with stakeholders, such as the environmental NGOs and others that were not able to be at the workshop, acknowledging that the participation of the workshop was limited to allow for more in-depth discussion. So setting up a process for dialogue with other stakeholders would provide an opportunity to build a more holistic understanding of the ARM framework and the key concerns that stakeholders would like to see addressed, and also a space for exploring some solutions or alternative methods. And the format of this dialogue would really dictate the resources required. But as an example, the Commission could start by engaging with stakeholders in a series of webinar meetings, which would not require a lot of resources. And the next suggestion addresses the recommendation that the ARM reward and utility functions should be refined with stakeholder input using current ASMFC processes. So the reward and utility functions are components of the ARM that essentially translate the management objectives into equations that solve for the recommended harvest from the ARM, given the horseshoe crab and red knot population data. So the workshop discussion concluded that these functions should be evaluated to see what changes could be made so that they might better align with stakeholders' concerns and values. And the process for doing this could take place through our typical committee meetings if they're tasked by the board to do that, and stakeholder engagement can be built into those meetings. And so I want to note that reviewing and coming up with modifications to consider for those reward and utility functions will take time and resources, and it would probably require at least another in-person meeting as well as multiple webinar meetings to really work through any changes. And then ultimately, if there are changes that the board wants to pursue, a management action would be needed to adopt those changes. And then the last two suggestions are a little bit easier to accomplish. So first is evaluating the advisory panel membership to make sure there's adequate representation for all of the stakeholder groups. And this can begin anytime really. So staff can work with the states to look at who is currently on the AP for each of the states and consider any changes. And another possibility would be to consider adding additional seats to this AP that specifically would be for those non-traditional stakeholders like the environmental NGOs. And then our last one, the workshop participants agreed that there is a need for efforts to improve the science communication around the ARM framework because it is a very challenging thing to explain and understand. another area where efforts could be focused in improving communication is around the commission's channels and processes for public engagement to increase the general public's awareness of when and how they can provide meaningful input on management. And this seems like it could be an opportunity where the environmental NGOs with an interest in horseshoe crab management could collaborate with the commission to help disseminate some information and also provide insight on how our communications about the ARM could be improved. So with that, I'm done, and Christina and I can answer questions.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Weaver, for that excellent report out on the workshop proceedings, and thanks to Caitlin for providing some clarity on actions the board could take coming out of the workshop. So let's start by looking around the room and online to see if anybody from the board has questions for Dr. Weaver or Caitlin about any of the information that was just presented. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands, so hallmark of a great presentation, answered all the questions. I will look around the room at this point to see if anybody has a motion or any other recommendations for action. Dan McKiernan.
Just a brief question. If Caitlin or anyone else who was involved could explain the reward and utility functions, especially for those who don't follow the ARM so closely.
I'm going to kick this one to our chair of the ARM committee, John Zwiga.
Thanks, Caitlin. So yeah, the reward function in this whole scheme is essentially what we want to maximize. And we get reward from both the harvest of horseshoe crabs and the abundance of red knots. So in the perfect world, you have high harvest of crabs and you have high abundance of red knots. How do we get to the reward function, or get to the reward function, is through the utility functions. And the utility functions describe how much value is placed upon harvest or bird abundance based upon the stakeholder values. So in terms of crabs, it's a proportion of maximum harvest. So if we're at a state where we can harvest 210,000 females and 500,000 males, that utility is equal to 1 or 100%. On the red knot side of things, the utility is 0 at our current abundance of red knots. And then once we approach 81,900 birds, which is a population threshold that was settled or agreed upon by all stakeholders years ago. Once we hit 90% of that 81,900 threshold, then red knots start to have utility, and then it increases to 1 once you surpass that threshold. So the reward function is the combination of both of the utilities. And then within the ARM framework, we have what's also known as the harvest policy functions. So granted, there's a lot of functions here that are very confusing. The harvest policy functions are actually what we solve for. And those are mathematical equations that tell us then what the optimal solution is given the abundance of crabs and the abundance of birds at a particular point in time. And that is the harvest that we should implement for our next recommendation for the next harvest season.
Okay, thanks, John. Bill Hyatt.
Thanks. Just a question I've been mulling over since the presentation. The last of the recommendations was a recommendation to increase science communication, and with sort of like the conclusion to collaborate with NGOs might be a great way to do that. And in thinking about that, I said, oh, that sounds like it just brings up all the issues that might be at loggerheads with some of the NGO community on. So kind of thinking that while that was a simple statement of the solution, the concept was that would be actually the last in line after some of those preceding recommendations, increasing stakeholder involvement, increasing membership on the advisory panel, et cetera, were implemented and brought to fruition. Am I kind of thinking of that correctly, or was there any discussion of how that recommendation might roll out?
So Christina, feel free to jump in if you have a better memory. But I think when these recommendations were developed and discussed at the workshop, there wasn't really an order given to them. As we just presented them, there's not necessarily an order there either. It's up to the board how you want to approach these things. But I do think they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. I think you could improve the communications and those relationships with the NGOs to try and think forward about how to better communicate these things while you're also working on solving the other questions.
Yeah, I can just add to that, Caitlin. There was a lot of creative dialogue around, what could be possible if there was a major investment in science communications, like hiring someone with that expertise, or, there was sort of creative brainstorming around it over the course of the workshop, really. It was a definite theme. But, I think as folks recognized, really there might be existing channels within the ASMFC where this could really be shored up. And one of the ways that the environmental NGOs and I think the other stakeholders as well could be useful is in clarifying what is confusing. So what about the existing ways of explaining the science might be difficult? In particular, even some of the scientists around the table were sort of acknowledging that they find it difficult to then explain to members of the public. Even if they have a sense of understanding, they have difficulty explaining it further. So that environmental NGOs might have a better sense of what has been difficult to grasp among their stakeholders and networks. And then the other piece related to this was not exactly the science communications, but an opportunity to broadcast more clearly to environmental NGOs and to the public, what are the existing channels for the public to engage with all of this, that those channels may not be fully understood or utilized, and that could be a communications issue. And again, one of the ways of kind of getting at that would be to better understand for those environmental NGOs and others, where is that breakdown and understanding happening in terms of really recognizing how they can engage. I hope that's helpful.
Okay, thank you, Caitlin and Christina. So again, I'll look around the room to see if anybody has a motion or a suggestion for how to move forward formally out of the workshop. John Clark.
Well, thank you. Let me use my brain power, see if I can get something up on the screen. And okay, here we go. Yes, I'd like to move that. Where is the? Okay, we're going right to that motion. Not okay. Got it. Move to initiate an addendum to consider the ability to set multi-year specifications for male-only horseshoe crab harvest of Delaware Bay origin-based horseshoe crabs on the ARM framework.
Okay, thank you, John. I'll look around the room to see if there's a second to the motion. Dan McKiernan.
Caitlin, didn't we have a little more added to that?
Did you want to add to the end of that, John?
Yes, and as Mike pointed out, it should be the ability to, well, no, it says ability. Okay, yes, to the end of that. I also wanted to add on there, okay, where do I have this? Oh, or an alternative male-only harvest specification setting method. And if I guess we're kind of doing this on the fly here, but I can speak to it after we have the set.
Okay, John, does what is on the screen right now reflect the motion you wanted to make?
Yes, it does, Mr. Chair.
Okay, and Dan McKiernan, the seconder, is indicating he's good with that as well. So we have a motion on the board. I'll turn it over to John to ask if he wants to provide some rationale.
Yes, I do. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. As we heard from the report on the workshop, which was really an excellent dialogue, and much appreciation to the staff from ASMFC, John and Kristen, for the great explanations of the ARM model, and to Christina for the great job of facilitating that. As we, I think, all understood, the question of female harvest is quite a difficult question right now for all the states that are part of the Delaware Bay resource. So we thought that this way we would still have the ARM set up, but we wouldn't have to go through all the work of setting specs that would include female specs every year. And I know that just running the arm every year is a lot of work. So this way, the thinking is that it'll be up to the board to set how many years in advance we could do this. But based on what we've been doing in recent years with the 500,000 quota of male horseshoe crabs that can be taken, which is less than 2% of the estimated population of males out there, that we could handle this safely for several years before we'd have to run an arm again. During that time, it might become more apparent that perhaps female harvest could be allowed, and then we could run the arm again. The last part of that, there are states that are harvesting some of the Delaware Bay origin horseshoe crabs, but also other horseshoe crabs. And that was put on there so that perhaps the technical committee and the stock assessment subcommittee might come up with a method just for estimating a male only harvest specification, if that's what we're going to be doing. That would take into account what those states, for example, Maryland and Virginia, are harvesting. So that's kind of the rationale here, a way to hopefully not get us into the situation like we're getting every year now, where as soon as the recommendations come out and there's that female harvest on their recommendation, it really sets off strong reactions from certain people. So I thought by doing this, perhaps we could at least calm things down and move ahead while we're working on the reward and utility functions, and see the next iteration of the arm, and then get back and look at the whole package again. Thanks.
All right, thank you, John. Dan, I'll turn to you as the seconder of the motion to see if you want to add any rationale.
No, thanks. I simply seconded to support our colleague at the ground zero.
Okay, thanks, Dan. I'll turn to the board to see if there's any discussion on the motion. Joe Semino?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. I think this gets at the heart of what the workshop kind of concluded. I think it's important to telegraph that if it is going to be male only, that we have the ability to do that for multi years, so that the public has that understanding, that, as Caitlin said, that this is a good idea to help us move forward with the stakeholdering and other work that we need to address possible changes to the arm in the future. And also signals to those that are working on the arm that they have some time to work on other stuff as we move forward. So I fully support the motion.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Rick Jacobson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am inclined to support the motion as well. I think what I've seen over the last couple of years is a consistent sentiment toward a male harvest only, in spite of the recommendations coming out of the arm itself. That said, in spite of my inclination to support the motion, I would want to hope that the commission and the board does not allow itself to be complacent in engaging with the public on this issue moving forward, that we stay engaged with the concerned constituents, NGOs, et cetera, so that as we do take up a new decision point at some number of years down the road, it doesn't come as any surprise to anyone, whatever our new position might be. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Mike Louisi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I certainly support the attempt here to go forward and to initiate the addendum for multi-year specifications. It's something that I've supported in other fisheries. I think that the multi-year specification setting is a cost savings, a resource savings process that allows us to set the stage not only for us and the staff that work on these plans, but for the industry as well, to know what's coming a few years from now. My only question And I anticipate that if we, at the end of this, when we are working on a multi-year specification process, Caitlin, do you have any thoughts as to whether or not there'd be any type of review? So let's say we set the specs for 3 years. Are we just going to ride those 3 years out, or do you see us checking along the way to make sure something hasn't changed enough for us to reconsider what we set? But by doing that work, that would be a kind of a checks and balance. Does that offset all of the savings and the resource savings and staff time and everything? Does one offset the other?
So I think it is up to the board whether or not you would specify that you want the ARM to be run every year, even if you're setting specifications for 3 years at a time. That would be up to you all. I do think it kind of would negate the cost savings part of it, because ARM being run is resources that we have to use. There is going to be an update every year from the Virginia Tech Trawl Survey, which is not going to be run through the ARM if you all don't want to run the ARM every year, but it will at least provide an indication of where the trawl indices are going from year to year.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. Just a quick follow-up to that. So, all right, that makes sense. In thinking about this, though, and maybe John, maybe you can help me understand. So let's say 5 years pass. It's almost 2030, and we're having this discussion again. However, at the red knot population and the horseshoe crab population have skyrocketed for some reason, and we find ourselves in a position to possibly consider multi-year specifications on something beyond just male only. Is that so to continue with the addendum and to have it evolve with the change in management, is that something that would need to be specified in this motion, or would it have to be a whole new addendum if we were going to do a multi-year spec setting process for both male and female?
I believe that if you specify here that you want the addendum to be male only, and that's what ends up being approved down the line if this continues going forward, then you would be limited to male only and you would need a new addendum. So it's definitely up to you how you craft this draft addendum and how that would impact your need to do a future addendum.
Tony, go ahead.
But I think I'm hearing folks not clearly understanding, I think, what this motion is saying. I think what this motion is saying is you're getting an additional tool in the toolbox. You have your ARM and the process that you use to set specifications every year through the ARM right now. You're adding another tool in the toolbox that will give you, or two or three tools, depending on what these alternative methods turn out to be. And the board can then decide which of the tools you're going to use to set your specifications. If you approve something that says you can set male only for 3 years, then the board would run the ARM, do your 3-year specification, and then after the 3rd year, I'm assuming that this addendum is going to say you need to run the ARM again at that time, and then you'll then again decide, am I going to use the method we have right now, or am I going to use some multi-year method that gets approved through this document?
I think the clarification maybe that Mike is looking for is about this male only part. So if in 3 years after they set specifications with male only harvest, and hypothetically the ARM is run again and the female population and the male population have exploded and they want to set female harvest, then it would be limited to 1 year at a time without a new addendum.
That clear it up, Mike?
Yeah, thank you. As long as we have the option down the road without having to start a whole new addendum to consider the female harvest. As John mentioned, some states are not harvesting 100% of their crabs from the Delaware Bay origin. I think the answer satisfies looking forward into the future and what tools we would have. Thanks.
Okay, I'll go to Eric Reed next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So following on the last two speakers, does the language we have now says we're going to do the ARM or mail only. Does that limit us moving forward, or should it be and or?
It says mail only harvest based on the ARM framework or an alternative mail only harvest specification setting method. So both of them are only mails in this particular motion. ARM or multi-year specs for mail only harvest.
Okay, thank you.
John, did you have your hand up before?
I was, no thanks, Mr. Chair. I was just going to respond to Mike, but Caitlin and Tony covered it beautifully.
Okay, thanks. Dan McKiernan.
So will the addendum document clarify the process by which there could be a female quota in the future? I'm seeing Tony nodding her head. Thanks.
We can certainly do that with your instruction.
I would recommend that.
Duly noted. All right, I'll look around the table to see if anybody else from the board has a comment. Do we have anybody online? I'll provide an opportunity for public comment. If there's anybody in the room from the public who'd like to comment on this motion, or anybody online, go ahead and raise your hand. All right, not seeing any more hands, we'll go ahead and move the question. I didn't hear anybody speak in opposition to this motion, so I'll start off by asking, is anybody opposed to this motion? Okay, not seeing any hands or any abstentions for the record. Okay, I see Georgia and Florida abstaining, and South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Thanks. Okay, this motion passes by consent with 3 abstentions as noted. Go ahead, John.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Caitlin, did we need a motion about asking the ARM subcommittee to review the reward and utility functions? Or is that just something we can ask them to do?
I think you can task the ARM subcommittee to get together and discuss what input would be needed to think about modifying those functions and then come back to the board.
Because John, I think that reward, in speaking with members of that group, that it's not a simple task just to redo that. It takes a significant amount of time. So if you're interested in understanding like what it means to do what was in Caitlin's recommendation slide, then that group can come back and give you some better understanding of that. But to actually do it is a much bigger thing.
Right. I mean, my point was just, does the ARM subcommittee need any further motion to proceed while we're doing the multi-year specifications? My assumption is that they'll be working on the reward and utility functions with, getting input and all that. So it could be a lengthy process. And just curious as to whether we have to ask for that to be done specifically, or if that's just going to proceed at this point.
So the intent of the recommendation from the workshop, I think, is to get input from stakeholders and to have a better understanding of where to go with those reward and utility functions. So it might be helpful for the ARM subcommittee to meet on its own to discuss what type of guidance would help them know where to go with those. And then if they come back to the board with some description of that process, maybe at that point the board could direct them to do something specific with those or consider certain changes to those functions based on the stakeholders' input, because there is that other recommendation for engaging with stakeholders about their key concerns.
But in other words, you don't need any specific input from the board right now to proceed with.
If they're going to meet, then yes, we would want
Oh.
a task for them to meet.
Well, in that case. Okay, so not a motion, just a recommendation to task the ARM subcommittee with reviewing the reward and utility functions to discuss what input from stakeholder groups would be needed to provide direction on changes.
Okay, thanks, John. I'll look to the board to see if there's any discussion on that idea that John brought up. Or any opposition on the board to that tasking? Not seeing any hands. I don't think we have any hands online, so we'll consider that the will of the board. Thanks, John. Mike Louisi.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Regarding the recommendations that came from the workshop, the other recommendations, is there anything that we need to do? Does the board need to approve those as paths forward?
I don't think anything else requires a motion or action, but I can move forward with affirmation from the board on looking into the advisory panel membership. And we can continue to think about how we would engage the stakeholders in some sort of dialogue. So I guess if that is the intent of the board, if you want to move forward with that recommendation or the others, then it would be good to have that clear on the record.
So with that, could I move? Do you want another motion? Or should I just say, yes, that all sounded great and hope everyone else says the same thing?
I think it's more the latter than the former. Essentially, you know, if anyone on the board has any objections to those two ideas that Mike just raised and Caitlin discussed, speak now or forever hold your peace, or we'll consider that the will of the board to move forward with exploring the advisory panel membership. Right, moving forward with exploring avenues for more dialogue with stakeholders. Also, if anyone has any additional thoughts or ideas along those lines, you know, feel free to share them at this point. Okay, not seeing any hands, so we'll consider that also the will of the board by consent to move forward with those two items. Roy Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm wondering if we have a definition of what success in managing these two resources looks like. Do we have a clear understanding of our ultimate goal in terms of, let's say, numbers of female horseshoe crabs, numbers of red knots? And if so, how will we know when we achieve success? Or conversely, even though we've bought some time for, I've heard the term or the word 3 years thrown around here. At what point will we know we have met the concerns of the NGOs? What defines success? Thank you.
It's a fair question, Roy. Almost seems like a question for happy hour or the hour after happy hour. I wish I had a good answer for you. I don't. I'll look to see if anyone up here at the table has some thoughts they want to share, or maybe somebody else out there on the board has some thoughts along those lines. Mike Louisi.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have an answer. I know that this was something that we discussed, you know, during the time that we all spent at this workshop, whether we were in the meeting or outside the meeting. Success and the thoughts about what success looks like was something that we were all a bit challenged by, because I think no matter, depending on where you're coming from, there's a different level of success. And if you took everyone's successes and stacked them all together, and if you had to achieve that, there would be no more ocean. It would just be horseshoe crabs, and the birds would be like pterodactyls coming down and picking you up and flying you away. There's a whole different level of what success looks like in different eyes. And that was a challenge, because at this group we had a little bit of everybody scattered throughout. Success on the commercial industry, they'd like to see some female harvest back. The red knot bird groups want to see a flourishing biomass of red knots. It was a challenge. I don't know that we're going to ever find something that we can just check to say we've succeeded, but I think the conversations that we've had, the ability to sit with one another and learn, to make adjustments to things when we are considering others' opinions about what success is, I think that is success, honestly. We've come a long way, and we all continue. I'm looking forward to continuing working on this process for the future. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
All right, thanks for that, Mike. Anybody else have any other thoughts to share on that topic? Oh, I don't know if we got to, oh, sorry, go ahead, John.
So Justin, thanks. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to speak to Mr. Miller's question about what are the target numbers, I can speak to some of the numbers within the current ARM framework and where things have value. For red knots, it's 81,900 birds. And that is basically based on how many birds there were out there in the early 90s. Original point or aerial count numbers of birds, some fraction of that. And from the original ARM, it got ramped up. So we were thinking there were approximately 90,000 birds using the Delaware Bay back in the early 90s. And the original ARM framework, it was said, okay, well, if we get back to half of that, we would be happy. So that is still based on the count, the aerial count numbers. So half of that would have been about 45,000. Then we started to use the Mark Reese site estimate of birds, realizing that the aerial counts are less than what's actually using the Delaware Bay. So then we, using the ratio of the two, we ramped that up to 81,900 birds. And that was when essentially the shorebird stakeholder group would feel comfortable. So if in our utility functions for red knots, there's zero value to the number of birds out there. Essentially, stakeholders are unhappy when there's less than 81,900 birds. Once you hit 81,900 birds, then we're happy. That satisfies the desires of the shorebird stakeholder group. So that's where the shorebird or all stakeholders, where their values are in place in the ARM, is through those utility functions. So at 81,900 birds, we're happy. That would, you could kind of think of that as a success, where utility is equal to 1. In terms of horseshoe crabs, we don't have a typical population threshold where, okay, now you can harvest, now you can't harvest. We used to in the previous ARM version, it was 11.2 million females. And that's when we said, okay, female harvest is now okay. Well, we've tripped that. We're beyond that. And that was one of the problems with the original ARM, is that we would automatically go to the maximum harvest. The way the current revised ARM is formulated, there's not a trigger there. There's not a set number of crabs where you can have harvest. Essentially, what we want to do is maximize the allowable harvest. So it's a proportion of maximum harvest. So we can have up to 210,000 females and 500,000 males. And we assume that females are worth twice as much as males. So the combination of both sex harvest, what's the proportion of the maximum value that we can have from harvest? And we try to, get to that, or you try to maximize that as long as it doesn't cause harm to red knots. And red knots are not limited by horseshoe crabs. So there's really not a population goal for horseshoe crabs. It's more of a harvest goal as long as it doesn't impair red knot population growth. So hopefully that kind of, sets us up for, what we may consider success.
Thank you, Dr. Suika. That helps clarify it for me.
All right, in the interest of time, I'm going to move on from this discussion. I want to check real quickly before we move on from this agenda item that there are no other additional actions or motions from the board on this agenda item dealing with the workshop. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands, so we'll go ahead and move on to our next item on the agenda, which is to set 2025 Delaware Bay bait harvest specifications. And we're going to start off here with a presentation from John Suica.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair. So the adaptive resource management model was revised and accepted by the board for management use in 2022. And it formulated the most recent addendum 8 to the fisheries management plan. And it's used annually to produce a bait harvest recommendations for the Delaware Bay area. Maximum, as we've said previously today, the maximum harvest that could be recommended is 210,000 females and 500,000 males. Last year, the ARM recommendation was 175,000 females and 500,000 males, but the board elected to implement a 0 female harvest. So the objective statement of the ARM framework is to manage harvest of horseshoe crabs in the Delaware Bay to maximize harvest, but also maintain ecosystem integrity, provide adequate stopover habitat for migrating shorebirds, and ensure that the abundance of horseshoe crabs is not limiting red knot stopover population or slowing recovery. So the data that's used in the ARM annually to make a harvest recommendation is the red knot population estimates from the mark recapture or mark resite analysis that is conducted by USGS, Jim Lyons in particular. And then also the horseshoe crab population estimates from the catch multiple survey model. Input to this model include the Virginia Tech Trawl Survey, the Delaware Adult Finfish Trawl Survey, New Jersey Ocean Trawl, and bait landings, discard estimates, and biomedical mortality. So here we have the red knot population estimates through time. You can see there's been some fluctuation in the most recent years, 2023 and 2024. We've gone from 39,361 birds up to 46,127. So a slight increase in 2024. I will note that when we make our annual recommendations, we look backwards 2 years. So we're using the 2023 mark resite estimates in order to make harvest recommendations for 2025. So we'd be using that 39,361 number, but we show the 2024 estimates here just for your reference. So the actual bait landings or total landings of females, which are comprised of bait, dead discards from other fisheries, as well as coast-wide biomedical mortality, is depicted in this graph through time. And you can see that the number of females that were harvested for bait decreased after the initial ARM or the original ARM was implemented in 2012. We've been at low levels since. The reason why there are still some bait landings is because not all of Virginia or some of Virginia's crabs are assumed to be of Delaware Bay origin, but still much less than the historic numbers. The dead discards from other fisheries, it's fluctuated and varied from year to year. We've put a lot of effort into trying to estimate dead discards from other fisheries, but again, the data is highly variable. And coast-wide biomedical mortality has tended to increase through time. And here we have the same time series, but for males. And you can see once the original ARM was implemented, the bait landings of males went up slightly and has been upwards, or although we're allowed upwards of 500,000 Delaware Bay origin males, you can see from this graph that even the actual number that are harvested by the bait industry is still less than 500,000 in the Delaware Bay area. And again, discards and biomedical mortality on this graph. Here is a graph of our female indices of abundance, and you can see that the Virginia Tech mature crabs and the New Jersey ocean trawl crabs, females, have greatly increased through time. In fact, the New Jersey ocean trawl has recorded its 2 highest catches of female horseshoe crabs in the last 2 years. The Delaware Adult Trawl Survey, females from that survey have increased up until about 2018 and then have shown a slight decrease since then. The circled area here is somewhat problematic, and I'll discuss this further. In the Virginia Tech Trawl Survey, over the past 4 years, there's been a very low abundance of newly mature crabs. So these are crabs that are, also known as premiparis crabs. They have just become mature and will spawn the following spring. And they've been low for the past 4 years. Moving on to our male indices of horseshoe crab abundance. Again, Virginia Tech, New Jersey Trawl, both have increased in recent years. And again, for the New Jersey Trawl Survey, the 2 highest recorded catches have come in the last 2 years. Like the females, the Delaware adult trawl peaked in 2018 and has been a bit lower since. But the interesting thing is with Virginia Tech newly mature males, they don't show the same decrease as the newly mature females have in the most recent 4 years. In fact, they're at their highest abundance yet. So this newly mature problem from Virginia Tech, we saw 0 female newly matures in 2022. So this presents a huge problem for our catch multiple survey analysis model that ultimately estimates the abundance of horseshoe crabs. The CMSA is a simple stage-based model that sums the newly mature and mature crabs, subtracts harvest and natural mortality, and predicts the population next year. It simply will not run if you have a estimate of 0 newly mature individuals going into the model as input. We've discussed possible reasons for these low numbers of newly mature females from Virginia Tech for a number of years now. The 3 possible hypotheses that we've discussed in the past have been catchability. Maybe it differs between newly mature males and newly mature females now. A recruitment failure event, which would mean just no recruitment for multiple years starting in about 2010. This seems unlikely because we still see newly mature males increasing. And the third hypothesis is an identification issue. Perhaps these newly mature male or females are being classified as some other life stage or some other stage of females. So last year, we developed a method to correct for this possibility of misidentification. Historical data indicated that newly mature females comprised approximately 20% of the total mature females. When I say total mature, I'm talking the newly mature plus mature. So what we did was we summed the newly mature and mature Virginia Tech estimates for 2019 to 2021, assumed that 20% were newly mature and 80% were mature, and then just reproportioned the total mature numbers. And we used the adjusted female numbers in the catch multiple survey analysis to then estimate the total female population size. Since that time, through conversations with Virginia Tech staff, as well as the boat captain that actually conducts the survey, we realized that newly mature females were most likely being misclassified as immature, not as mature. We saw this increase in mature crabs or fully mature female crabs through time. We thought, well, perhaps the reason why it's increasing so much is because of newly matures are getting misclassified as fully matures. Turns out this really wasn't the case when we dive more deeply into the issue and discuss it with Virginia Tech staff and the boat captain. What's likely happening is the increase in abundance of crabs makes processing a representative subsample more difficult. Not as many non-mature female crabs were probed for the presence of eggs as probably should have been in most recent years. The staff that are collecting the crabs on the boat, they just got a lot of crabs and have to process them as quickly as they can. Perhaps that's they're missing the newly mature crabs. So at the end of the day, we've come to the conclusion that our correction method for 2023 was actually wrong. We pulled the newly matures out of the mature group when they should have been pulled out of the immature group. So how do we correct for this? We know our method that we used last year is wrong, but based on the biology of the crab, how do we get an increase in mature females, but yet this absence of newly mature females? It's just mathematically and biologically impossible. So we posed the question, can we infer female newly matures from the male newly matures? And if we think about the life history of horseshoe crab, after hatching, there's really no reason to believe that natural mortality would differ between the sexes during the immature stages. Males will mature earlier than females, and the newly mature stage only lasts 1 year. So since the newly mature males in year T and the newly mature females in year T+1 represent the same cohort of crabs, there should be some positive relationship between the two. And also the number of newly mature females in year T+1 should be somewhat less than the number of newly mature males in year T, because they would have one more year's worth of natural mortality prior to becoming newly mature. So when we look back through the time series of data from Virginia Tech up to 2018, prior to when we see this big decrease in newly mature females, we actually do see that positive relationship. So here we have plotted the number of newly mature females at time T+1 versus the number of mature males at time T. And we see that there is a strong positive relationship between the two. And also the slope of that line is slightly less than 1, which is indicative of an additional year's worth of natural mortality before the females become newly mature. So if we use this relationship then to correct the newly mature estimates coming from the Virginia Tech Trawl Survey, it does change numbers, and it does actually increase numbers. So the columns here on the far left in yellow, these are what are actually observed and estimated by Virginia Tech. So for example, these are in millions of horseshoe crabs. So for example, in 2019, we would have 240,000 newly mature females. By using our new corrected method for correction, this would then increase to 2.72 million newly mature females. Now, it does increase the total number of crabs that we think that are out there, which some may view as biasing the numbers. And certainly, we don't like to do this, but we have to recognize that what we're observing from Virginia Tech is, seems to be biologically impossible. So in the ideal situation, we would revert back to using Virginia Tech estimates provided as they're provided from the trawl survey directly. That would be a priority. But in the interim, we do need to use some sort of a correction. And I will also note that this correction will need to be made next year, because Virginia Tech estimated 0 newly mature females again in the fall of 2023. But at the same time, it was the highest number of total mature females over any time. So again, it doesn't make sense that we're getting no newly matures, but yet our matures are at all-time highs. So if we use our corrected numbers in the catch multiple survey analysis, these are the results in our population estimates of mature females. I have both the CMSA run with and without coastwide biomedical mortality. And you can see that the biomedical mortality really makes no difference at all. The two projections or two predictions of total abundance of female horseshoe crabs are nearly identical between those two scenarios. So in the Virginia Tech, in our last year here, the Virginia Tech trawl survey population estimate from the swept area abundance was 11.54 million females, and our CMSA estimate is 16.6 million females in 2023. For mature males, again, similar to females, we're at pretty high abundance, and we don't have to use any kind of newly mature adjustment for males. The Virginia Tech population estimate was 25.4 million males in the terminal year and 30.4 million males from the catch multiple survey analysis. And once again, essentially no difference at all between inclusion or exclusion of biomedical mortality. So given these estimates of birds and crabs, our harvest recommendation is based on our harvest policy functions that were optimized in the ARM revision. And as per Addendum 8, we then round down our recommended harvest to the nearest 25,000 crabs. And this is an effort to further protect confidential biomedical data. So for 2025, the recommended ARM harvest would be 500,000 males and 175,000 females. And then when we also account for Maryland and Virginia crabs not being of total Delaware Bay origin, these are the final total quotas according to the allocation scheme within the addendum. So you can see that in the end, the total quota ends up being slightly higher than the Delaware Bay origin quota. So in total, it would be 513,000 males and 185,000 females. So at this time, I'll turn it over to Caitlin, who can discuss, setting the specifications.
Thank you, John. My part is very brief. This is the board action for consideration today. So you're considering setting harvest specifications for 2025 harvest for the Delaware Bay origin crabs. I did want to put up a table of what exactly the board did last year, just so you have this as a point of comparison. Last year, the board implemented 0 female harvest as opposed to the recommended 175,000 and 500,000 males. And this is the breakdown with the allocations that are in Addendum 8.
Okay, thank you, John and Caitlin. We'll start off by looking around to see if anybody has any questions for John and Caitlin about the information that was presented. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands, so I'll ask if anybody has a motion relative to specifications. Joe Semino.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Since it's not up yet, I'll move that Dr. Davis has to stick around for at least another 3 years. So status quo on Dr. Davis. Oh, sorry, there's a different motion. Okay, sorry. Move to accept the 2025 Adaptive Resource Management Harvest Specifications with 500,000 males and no female harvest of Delaware Bay origin crabs. In addition, the 2-to-1 offset will be added to Maryland and Virginia's allocations due to the no female harvest.
Okay, thank you, Joe. I see John Clark raising his hand a second. I'll turn back to Joe to see if you want to provide any rationale as the maker of the motion.
I personally believe that we need to continue to express caution. I'm very supportive of revisiting, what we're trying to seek out of the ARM model, and I'm encouraged. I think we're seeing some positive trends, but I think we got a long way to go. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Joe. John, any additional rationale?
No, that's, I think we'll just continue doing what we've been doing. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, John. I'll look to the board, see if there's any discussion on the motion. No hands online, I take it. Okay, we'll go ahead and move the question. I'll start by asking, are there any objections to this motion? Not seeing any hands, I'll ask if there's any abstentions for the record. Okay, let's see if I can get this right this time. Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina abstaining. All right, so this motion passes by consent with 3 abstentions as noted. Thanks. I'll look to Caitlin, but I believe that concludes the business on that agenda item. Okay, moving on to the next item on our agenda, considering approval of fishery management plan review and state compliance reports for 2023. I'll turn it over to Caitlin.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair. So I'll go through this somewhat briefly, but this is the management history for the horseshoe crab FMP. The FMP was originally approved in 1998, and it's been modified by 8 addenda, and the most recent of those is Addendum 8, which was approved last year to adopt the use of the ARM revision for setting the Delaware Bay harvest specifications, which you just used. And this next figure shows the annual values of reported horseshoe crab bait harvest in orange, biomedical collections in light blue, and the estimated biomedical mortality in dark blue. And these are in millions of crabs. You'll see the bait landings since about 2003 have fluctuated around the same level. And in the last 8 years or so, there has been an increasing trend in the biomedical collections, which is light blue bars, and the mortality, which is the dark blue. The total reported bait harvest for 2023 was 738,789 crabs, excluding the confidential landings from Florida. And the 2023 landings represent a 29% increase from the 2021 landings, 2022 landings. And they're still well below the Commission's coastwide quota for horseshoe crabs, which is 1.59 million crabs, as well as the total state imposed quota, which is 1.03 million crabs. The states of Maryland, Delaware, Massachusetts, New York, and Virginia make up 99% of the 2023 coastwide landings, and Maryland, Delaware, and Massachusetts harvest the highest numbers. For biomedical in 2023, the number of crabs collected for the sole purpose of LAL production in the biomedical industry was 1,113,644 crabs. And this is a 22% increase from the 2022 numbers. The estimated biomedical mortality was 178,232 crabs. And this number includes the observed mortalities that are reported by each state, plus 15% of the total number of crabs bled. The biomedical mortality represents about 19% of the total directed mortality for horseshoe crab in 2023, which is about 917,000 crabs. So compared to 2022, in 2023, there was an increase to the overall mortality, including both bait harvest and biomedical mortality. And here you can see the overall mortality as a total area of this graph, with the orange area representing the mortality from bait harvest and the blue area representing the estimated biomedical mortality. So you can see how these two relate to each other in scale. So for de minimis status, states can qualify if their combined average bait landings for the last 2 years are less than 1% of the coastwide bait landings for the same 2-year period. And South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida requested and meet the criteria for de minimis status. The plan review team had a few notes to highlight from the compliance report reviews. First, the Delaware State bait landings exceeded the state quota in 2023, so their 2024 quota was decreased to account for that. In Connecticut, also, as of October 1st, 2023, the state prohibited all hand harvest of horseshoe crab and their eggs. And in addition, the New York State Legislature is currently considering a bill that would prohibit all commercial and biomedical harvest of horseshoe crabs. The status of that bill is that it passed the state Senate and next would be considered by the governor, if my information is still correct. And then lastly, for 2023, Massachusetts also reduced their state imposed quota to 140,000 crabs. Additionally, while they were reviewing the state compliance reports, the PRT noted that Maryland regulations allow horseshoe crab harvest starting May 1st, whereas no harvest of Delaware Bay origin crabs is allowed by other states from January 1st to June 7th. In the Delaware Bay region. And the PRT has some concerns that this is creating a little bit of an inconsistency within the Delaware Bay region. And additionally, that January to June closure provisions for New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland they came from Addendum 6. But according to Addendum 6, the season closure provision expired in April 2013. So I'm not bringing this up because Maryland has incorrect regulations, but just as a note from the PRT that it's inconsistent with the other states. But Addenda 7 and 8 do not contain any seasonal provisions. So the PRT is really just looking to the board to clarify whether this season closure provisions were intentionally or unintentionally excluded from the latter addenda, and if anything needs to be considered regarding those seasons. For the PRT recommendations, this relates back to the last slide, the first one relating back to the issue of the seasonal harvest closures for the Delaware Bay region. And the PRT also continues to recommend the commission prioritize finding long-term funding for the Virginia Tech Trawl Survey, since this is providing critical data for our current management program. It's currently ongoing this year. And then the last recommendation here is that we should be working toward getting annual estimates of horseshoe crab dead discards from other fisheries. And then with regard to the state compliance, there's only one minor issue that the PRT noted, and that is that the compliance report from Massachusetts was not submitted by the July 1st deadline. And other than that, all of the states and jurisdictions appear to be in compliance with the requirements of the FMP. So the PRT recommends approval of the state compliance reports and de minimis requests and the FMP review for the 2023 fishing year.
Okay, thank you, Caitlin. Any questions from the board on FMP review and state compliance reports for the 2023 fishing year? John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Caitlin, for that great report. I'm just curious to the point about the closure from January 1st to June 7th. To put that back in the FMP, could that be made part of the addendum we are considering about setting the multi-year specs?
Yes, I think that would be within the board's purview.
May I make a motion to make that recommendation?
Go ahead, John.
Yes, I'd like to move that the closure dates for horseshoe crab harvest for Delaware Bay origin horseshoe crabs from January 1st to June 7th be put into the proposed addendum that we will be, I guess, starting as of today. I don't know how you want to word that, but just wanted to put that back in. And if I can get a second for that, I'll just speak to it.
All right, thanks, John. I'm going to wait till we have the motion up on the board and make sure it reflects your intent. Sure, while we're waiting, go ahead, Dan.
While we're waiting, maybe John could explain to me if Maryland is having a season outside of the prescribed closure, and that closure is designed to protect Delaware Bay origin crabs. If those crabs are coming on the beach in Maryland, does that suggest that they're not Delaware Bay origin? What is the concept of Delaware Bay origin, and how does that work relative to the adjacent states?
If I would, don't mean to speak for Maryland, but from what I understand from Maryland, they don't allow beach harvest, but this is just, there could have been harvest of females that would be coming from other methods, dredges, trawls. I don't know what might be used, but I guess once I get a second, I could speak more to it.
John, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and read this motion into the record if it reflects your intent.
Sure. Move that the draft addendum initiated today also consider establishing a season start date of June 7th for the Delaware Bay region. And yes, that does capture it.
Around the room for, I see Ray Kane seconding. John, do you want to provide any additional rationale?
Thank you. Yes. I know that I'm sure the harvest coming from Maryland before June 7th, if there's probably minimal, but it is a perception issue. You know, the more any harvest of mature female horseshoe crabs before the red knots get here, and while the red knots are here, of course, is that many less sweet horseshoe crab eggs on the beach for the red knots. So we want to leave as many of them as we can. And so by having a uniform June 7th start date to the harvest season, I think it would help.
All right, thanks, John. I'll turn to Ray to see if you want to provide any additional rationale.
No, I seconded for the purpose of discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ray. Mike Louisi, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I guess the question is, if by supporting this, John, are you suggesting that the May 1st harvest period for which crabs could be harvested from non-Delaware Bay origin, not that we can determine that by looking at the crab, but in practice, Maryland, Virginia, as you get further away from the epicenter, from the center of Delaware Bay, there are fewer and fewer crabs that are from that origin. They're coming from other places. So is this saying that May 1st start date is off the books entirely?
Well, Mike, this would just put an option into the addendum to do this, to create a uniform date. I think, during the process, we could have a lot more discussion about it, but I just would like to see it at least considered in the addendum. Thanks.
Is that good, Mike?
Yeah, I'll support it as far as it going into the addendum, but as long as it's just the option, we can have a time to talk about how that fleshes itself out. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Mike. I'll look around the table to see if there's any additional hands. Joe Semino.
Yeah, thanks. I'm supportive of the motion. I'm also curious if it would be more accurate to say reestablishing, but I would hope that without going too far down a rabbit hole, that there could be some exploration on whether or not it was ever intended to be dropped in the first place as we start to look back into this. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Any additional discussion on the motion? Take it we don't have any hands online. So I'll ask if there are any objections to this motion. Go ahead, Dan.
Point of clarification. I think June 7th is the last of the closed period as opposed to the open date. Is there some confusion about the June 7th date?
Good catch, Dan. Yeah, actually, June 7th is the last closure date. Season's open on June 8th.
Okay, so you want to modify the motion to June 8th. I'll look to Ray Keynes if he's okay with that. John, you want to reread the motion into the record?
With pleasure. Move that the draft addendum initiated today also consider establishing a season start date of June 8th for the Delaware Bay region.
Okay, thanks, John. So again, I'll turn to the board to see if there's any objections to this motion. Not seeing any abstentions for the record. Okay, I'm seeing an abstention from Florida, South Carolina, and Georgia. So this motion passes by consent with 3 abstentions as noted. Okay, so we still need a motion to approve the FMP review and compliance reports. Mike Louisi.
I'd be happy to make that for you, Mr. Chairman, once it's on the board. Move to approve the Horseshoe Crab FMP review for the 2023 fishing year, state compliance reports and de minimis status for South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida.
All right, thanks, Mike. And I see a second from Pat Gear. Any discussion on this motion? Okay, not seeing any hands. Any objections to this motion? Any abstentions for the record? None, so this motion passes by unanimous consent. Okay, so I think we are on to our final item on the agenda, which is to elect a vice chair for this board. I see Eric Reed's hand up.
Yeah, I have a point of order, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Semino had a motion to make sure that you stayed for 3 years in your position. I didn't get the disposition of that particular motion, which I'd be happy to second at this point.
I'm going to use my prerogative as board chair and not entertain that motion at this time. So we are looking for a vice chair for this board. As Joe was alluding to, I will be stepping down as the chair of this board after this meeting. So this is an exciting opportunity for rapid advancement here, folks. So I'll look to see if somebody has a motion and wants to nominate somebody as the vice chair of this board. Dan McKiernan.
I would like to nominate Eric Reed as the next chairman of this board.
Very good. Do I have a second for that motion? Mike Louisi. Any discussion on the motion whatsoever? No. Okay, not seeing any hands. Any objections? All right, seeing none. Congratulations, Eric, and thank you.
I was going to have to run my own personal success model because I think it might have to change from what it was when I got up this morning, but thank you.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of our agenda. I'll ask if there are any other business to come before this board. All right, not seeing any hands, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. So moved by a bunch of folks. This board stands adjourned. Thank you.